welcome to At Your Convenience. I'm Rachel Janak, Conference Content Manager at Informa. I'm here today with Arjun Chakravarti, Managing Partner at Cognition Analytics. Thanks for being here today. How are you?
Hey, great to be here, Rachel. Always a pleasure to talk to you and this great sort of community. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about what's happening in the economy right now and what it means for C-store retailers, navigating uncertainty, and customer and consumer behavior. Arjun, you're going to be at Outlook this year, but you've been before. How many years have you been to Outlook now?
This will be my third year, I believe, speaking at
Okay.
Outlook. It's really sort of one of the premier places, I think, to get sort of high level industry sort of directional output and understanding of where we're going, as an industry, as an organization, where, all of the big sort of thought leaders and organizational leaders, really have time to convene and sort of talk through where we think the state of the industry is and what the critical investments are going to be. And it's one of those really collaborative industries. You don't always get to see that in a lot of other spaces, and so it's great to see that interaction happening in this venue.
How would you describe the current environment, kind of in plain English, for C-store retailers?
Yeah, I think at Outlook, what I'm going to talk about sort of by extension is sort of an updated version of what we can talk about a little bit today here, which is that, obviously I don't have to tell anybody we're in a very uncertain and challenged environment, but a lot of it really does come down to breaking down why, right? And I think a lot of times what happens with folks who are trying to get a read on the economy is we're all very, very busy people, and it can be very, very difficult to sit down and sort of decipher kind of one article at a time, kind of what the general sense is, consensus is on what's happening in the economy. We certainly know what's happening in our own organizations and see it and have to respond to it. But being able to step out and saying like, look, how different or similar are we to others who's feeling pain points, that can be hard. And so, with that in mind, what we like to do, when we're talking at Outlook is to first talk through sort of the state of the consumer economy, right? And what the challenges are often there is that you're dealing with a lot of differentials in ability to spend in households right now. And so, you see that the economy right now feels very uncertain, but then there's just been this bump in spending. And in the beginning of the year, it's not hitting every industry, and it's not, hitting uniformly. But what's happening is that we do have a lot of income inequality right now that we've been talking about as a theme at Outlook over the past few years and how we respond to it. That's definitely something that we're seeing is holding up a lot of the economy, is that these very wealthy households, who are invested in AI, et cetera, are really driving the vast majority of spending. And we are seeing pressures kind of downstream, right? So more and more over time, we're seeing sort of operators needing to be ahead of who is it that they're really serving? What are their kind of pain points at this point in time? And, what are the offerings that we can provide to kind of, hit on those constraints that are emerging in the market? So we're definitely seeing a lot of that on the consumer side. And we'll talk about the details as to why we're seeing inflation bump up quite a bit right now, mostly on the back of gas prices. But there are a lot of dynamics, at Outlook that we'll talk about as to sort of, what the driving forces are moving forward and whether we can expect to see some differences there from the current state. But what I'll talk a lot about at that event is really, why we're seeing this bump up now, why we might be expecting to see some slowing later, and where there are going to be strong points and what the underlying causes of that are.
Yeah, you touched on a point that I think at some of our CSP forums has been a theme, which is not shying away from setting prices for those higher income households who are willing to spend more. So that was interesting to me. But is there any specific areas that consumers are willing to spend more or where they're more so pulling back?
It's interesting. I mean, because area actually applies in both sort of senses of the word right now. Like, I think when you think about area in terms of regions, actually starting there, we're seeing a lot of strength in parts of the economy, like in Texas, Florida. We know that the Southeast has been growing faster than the rest of the country. But then in terms of But then you also have to account for things like, costs rising higher in those places than a lot of other places as well. Things like rents, for instance. And so there's balancing effects of people having jobs, in those areas as opposed to others. But then you're also talking about areas, right? I think I think the core of your question is relates to, what are people spending on, right? And, I think what we are seeing is that there's general broad-based cutbacks happening right now. Where wealthier households are spending the most right now really is they're not, airline prices, for example, are up about 27% this summer year over year. And but you're also seeing that those folks are not kind of willing to back off on that kind of spend right now, right? That leisure spending, I guess it's been a stressful year. People don't want to give up their vacations if they're gainfully employed. And so starting to see sort of occasion based spend is in fact quite important. But at the same time, right, those, folks who are kind of spending on, summer travel, for instance, right, and might be taking driving trips, for instance, they might still, pack in the car and do more, but they are, we are seeing reports of a broader base of the economy kind of saying, let's cut back and let's look at a value base here. Some interesting, opportunities in C-store, for example, are really relate to, just what can I do without stopping, right? It's sort of the notion of I'm setting trips and I'm reducing trips and I'm being very mindful about where I'm going. You know, willingness to spend psychologically, we're seeing is changing a lot in terms of, if I'm out right now, whether it's to fill up the car or to do whatever, I'm going to get what I need to get now because I don't want to drive again. That's the salient cost driver. Sometimes it's cost of milk or something, or eggs or something. Right now, it's this is the thing people are sort of queuing in on in terms of savings, right? So that changes a shift in terms of potential promotional cycles, we think, moving forward.
Yeah, it's such a great point. So another issue that a lot of retailers are facing right now is labor, and staffing. So what are you seeing in the labor market today, and kind of like what's the outlook on that?
Yeah, labor market's kind of got two pieces to it right now, right? I mean, right now, I'd say at a high level, if you have a job, you're doing pretty okay. But if you've lost a job, there's a real difficulty, right? So there's the layoff environments actually outside of sort of software and tech, right, is actually pretty standard, at sort of historical levels pre-pandemic. So we're not so worried about layoffs in that sense right now at the current state, right? Things can obviously change, for instance, like if profit margins remain depressed because of the war, et cetera. But as of now, outside of tech, we're seeing a lot of stability. But if you're losing your job right now, it's really, really hard to come back in, especially in those higher kind of education income kind of brackets. It's been particularly difficult the last 2 or 3 years. And so at a high level, as that relates to people's willingness to spend, we're sort of seeing people, grin and bear it right now. But then in terms of what it means for the industry and labor availability, there is still tightness, right? Because we've seen sort of U.S. migration fall pretty dramatically, and I think that's going to be a continued issue, moving forward for the industry. And so we are going to have to continue to kind of, talk about labor in some substantial way in our planning.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to ask about tariffs. What do you think that convenience retailers need to understand about the potential impact of tariffs on their business?
Gosh, I mean, right now it's a real set of uncertainties, right? Because the first thing you have to think about is what were the implications for your organization as it related to getting refunds, right? So, for instance, did the previous Supreme Court ruling that in effect invalidated a lot of the tariffs by the administration? To what degree are you eligible for refunds as it relates to that? A lot of larger organizations are saying that that's going to be substantial to their bottom lines this year. And I think that's sort of a first sort of scenario is that changing the competitive landscape somewhat. And I think the second issue related to tariffs is it over? And I would say no, right? Because the thing about it is that when you read the rulings kind of closely, what you're seeing is that it's not that tariffs were broadly invalidated, right? What you're actually seeing is that the administration, if they choose to enact further tariffs, have to sort of engage in different procedures and activities and ways of going around it, which probably have more legal standing but are procedurally more difficult, right? And a good example of that might be something like um, going after countries that have labor violation abuses. For instance, we've been seeing some countries in Asia being um, levied with those kinds of accusations, and then tariffs being applied within that through that mechanism, right? And I don't know sort of at this point whether those have better legal standing per se, but you're starting to see those kinds of secondary approaches being used in substitution to the old tariff procedures. And so I think that's the thing that we're going to have to see play out a little bit more. The second thing I would say is that if you're sort of exposed to produce, for example, or trade from Mexico and Canada, we've got a potential reset on the USMCA free trade agreement in July, and that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Is that something you'll give an update on at Outlook since it's in August?
Yeah, presumably, yes. I think there'll likely be a lot of interest there. And I think to the degree that there's connections to the supply chain as it relates to C-stores and retailing generally, we're going to get into a lot of that detail at the event.
For sure. Do you have any advice for retailers to combat supply chain issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, I think the thing that we have all as an industry been sort of emphasizing, but maybe perhaps implementing it to varying different degrees, is the notion of how well you've been tracking, right? And your costs, right? So are you auditing costs, across the stream really well? Are you tracking surcharges? Because there are things that creep into invoices when you're not sort of vigilant about them that I think we really need to see. And I think there's a lot of operational spread that you're going to have to manage against. And I think I mean, right now that starts with, and we've, with loyalty, retail media kind of operations, but increasingly that's not going to be enough, right? And we're going to have to talk about sort of other techniques combined with a much, much deeper understanding of the changing consumer behavior um, in this current environment to kind of get to an effective point of being able to be operationally agile and respond to these changes. And so it does start with loyalty. It does start with sort of being, better at understanding kind of where people are. But with AI and a lot of these other ways that people are shopping now, and seeking advice, I think you're going to have to really think about how they're looking at occasions in a different way. So, more to come at Outlook, but for now, that's got to be the basis for everything. Loyalty, analytics, a lot of labor optimization as well. Will be key inputs.
And you kind of touched on it, but is there any areas that you think retailers are kind of overestimating AI's capabilities or underestimating, or maybe not over or underestimating, but think like things will move quicker than they will, or kind of that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at our company, that's actually something we work pretty centrally on. And, it's interesting because we see two different kinds of, folks, right, when it comes to AI. And they're characterized exactly the way you just laid them out. Some who are massively overestimating and some that are massively underestimating. And the ones that are kind of um, underestimating, I think they're not sort of, queuing into how quickly things like marketing are changing, right? And so in our company, for example, we work with a lot of folks who are doing, B2B sales and services, et cetera. And in that particular realm, we've seen a complete shift in how people look for and seek products and choose products, right? And it's a very, very different mechanism than the traditional top-down marketing funnel. Whereas people who are overestimating, it's often an issue of, oh, wow, this stuff seems like it can do anything at any point. And, I work pretty deeply in this stuff every day. And even I find myself guilty of that. I'm just, I'm actually finding myself sort of being like, why isn't this easier still?
Uh-huh.
And there's almost this ease of expectation. And in reality, what happens is that um, there's a kind of a disconnect, I think, between people's sort of understanding of or appreciation that they know a lot more in their heads about how their businesses work. And there are just things that AIs can't touch, and that interface needs to happen and be set up more precisely before you let an AI or an agent kind of off into running certain processes. But you do have to be aware right now that AIs are really pretty much at the side of your consumer right now. And even in what you would think are these convenience occasion based sort of settings, and you're going to need to figure out sort of how to influence them. And whereas you might have thought, even a few years ago that like brand based building, brand building was really a top of funnel activity. Now it might be the arbiter of trust, right? So you might be building and investing in brand as opposed to not so much for just for top level stuff, but for people being like, hey, when I get this thing recommended to me, is this a group that I trust or not? And it also introduces, new difficulties like, well, if I'm too familiar in this recommendation engine, do they think that I paid for it? Right.
Uh-huh.
Because that's a little bit less clear than Google searches, right? In terms of paid ad search and organic search, right? So there's a lot of nuance there to work through,
Okay.
when we're thinking about opportunities. And I don't know how deep I'll get into that at Outlook, but I'll be there for the week to talk about it. So
Yeah.
on the side, if people are interested.
For sure. Great. Well, we covered a lot today. We kind of scratched the surface on a lot of different topics. But just before we go, just wanted to ask you if there are any additional insights or trends that you'll be diving deeper into at Outlook, or, that we didn't have time to cover here that people can look
Yeah,
forward to.
no, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you can expect from me at Outlook is again a contemporary view of where the state of the consumer is, really unpacking, who's thriving, who's seeing headwinds at a consumer level, and really telling that narrative of why some consumers are doing better than other and what their prospects look like, and then running that all the way down through to the implications for the industry and understanding again like the things we've touched on here. What's the state of tariffs? What's the state of labor? um, what does inflation mean when it translates from the consumer into our supply chain, right? And importantly, one thing I didn't mention here is I want everyone, I would want everyone to think about it as, you're engaging in retailing broadly, but this is an industry that touches many spaces, right? Whether it's gas, whether it's beverage, whether it's sort of um, other sort of packaged goods to contend with. And there's a constellation of competitors who are facing the same pressures. And one thing I think we're going to talk a lot about at Outlook is giving you that broader look of who really is your competitive set now, and how are they all reacting, and what does that mean, and what does that mean for opportunities for this space as well. Because I think there is an increasing sort of awareness that the world's much broader than the folks down the road, right? And I think that's going to be a really exciting set of conversations to have it out. Looking forward to seeing everyone there again. It's always just one of my favorite communities to interact with, and so it's a pleasure to be invited again. Thanks so much.
So, well, it was so great talking to you, Arjun. Thank you so much for being on.
Yep, take care. Thanks again, Rachel.
Thanks. Well, this has been At Your Convenience, and I'm Rachel Janak. Have a great day.